The date was November 29th, 1943. While most Americans focused on battles in Europe and the Pacific, a forgotten war raged in the frozen edges of Alaska. Japanese forces had occupied the Aleutian Islands since June 1942, and the North Pacific had become a brutal theater where men fought not just the enemy, but nature itself. Captain William Thies sat in the operations tent at Adak Army Airfield, staring at a crumpled radio message that had arrived 30 minutes earlier. His hands trembled, not from the cold that seeped through every crack in the canvas walls, but from what the message contained. 15 B-24 Liberator crew members were down. Their bomber had crashed on Atka Island during a reconnaissance mission over Japanese-held Kiska. The island sat 200 miles west, deep in contested waters. The men were alive, huddled in the wreckage, but they wouldn't be for long. Temperatures hovered at 15 degrees below zero. Winds exceeded 60 miles per hour. A massive storm system was moving in from the Bering Sea. These read the coordinates again. Atka Island. No airstrip, no flat ground. Just volcanic rock, ice, an enemy patrol boat circling the surrounding waters like sharks. The radio operator, Sergeant Danny Morrison, looked up from his equipment. He was 22 years old and had been in Alaska for 8 months. He'd seen men lose fingers to frostbite while eating breakfast. He'd watched aircraft ice over mid-flight and plummet into the ocean. "Sir, command says we can't authorize a rescue," Morrison said quietly. "Weather's too severe. They're calling it a suicide mission." These stood up and walked to the tent entrance. Outside, snow fell sideways. The wind howled like something alive and angry. 300 yards away, a row of P-38 Lightnings sat covered in ice, their engines cold and silent. "Get me Lieutenant Hayes," Thies said. Morrison hesitated. "Sir Hayes just finished an 18-hour patrol. He's been off duty for 3 hours. I don't care. Get him." 20 minutes later, First Lieutenant James Hayes pushed through the tent flap, still wearing his flight suit. He was 25, lean, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many missions and not enough sleep. He'd flown more combat hours in the Aleutians than any other pilot in his squadron. Hayes read the message Thies handed him. His expression didn't change. "You volunteering?" Thies asked. Hayes looked at the map spread across the operations table. Atka Island was marked with a red circle. Between Adak and Atka lay 200 miles of the most treacherous airspace in the world. The Aleutian chain was known as the birthplace of winds. Pilots called it the graveyard. "I'll need a Catalina," Hayes said. "The PBY can handle water landings. There's no water landing zone near the crash site. It's all rock and ice. Then I'll find one." Thies shook his head. "Command won't authorize it. The storm's getting worse. You'd be flying blind into Japanese territory with zero visibility and no backup." Hayes met his eyes. 15 men are dying right now. Every hour we wait, that number goes down. You could die too. Then I'll die trying to bring them home." The tent went silent except for the wind battering the canvas. Morrison watched the 2 officers, barely breathing. Thies made his decision. "You've got 2 hours before the storm hits peak intensity. After that, nothing flies. Not us, not the Japanese, not God himself." Hayes was already moving toward the door. Hayes Thies called after him. "If you pull this off, they'll court-martial both of us for defying orders. If you don't make it back, your family gets a letter saying you died in a training accident. No glory, no recognition." Hayes paused at the entrance. "I'm not doing this for glory, Captain." The consolidated PBY Catalina flying boat sat in its hangar like a sleeping whale. The aircraft was designed for maritime patrol and rescue, with a wingspan of over 100 feet and the ability to land on water in moderate seas. But what Hayes was planning went far beyond moderate. He found his crew chief, Master Sergeant Eugene Foster, already prepping the aircraft. Foster was 41, old enough to be exempt from combat duty, but he'd volunteered anyway after his son died at Guadalcanal. "Word travels fast," Hayes said. Foster didn't look up from the engine he was inspecting. "You're out of your mind, Lieutenant. This bird's been sitting in sub-zero temps for 6 hours. The oil's thick as molasses. And you want to fly her into a Category 4 storm. Can you get her ready?" Foster wiped his hands on a rag, his weathered face creased with concern. "I can get her ready. Question is whether she'll stay in the air once you're up there. That's my problem." "No, sir, that's our problem. Because I'm coming with you." Hayes started to protest, but Foster cut him off. "You'll need a flight engineer if something goes wrong mid-air, and something will go wrong. It always does." Within 40 minutes, they'd assembled a skeleton crew. Co-pilot Lieutenant Marcus Webb, a former bush pilot from Montana, who knew how to fly in impossible conditions. Radio operator Corporal Timothy Chen, whose steady hands could repair equipment in mid-flight. An airman First Class Robert Sullivan, a medic who'd patched up more wounded men than he could count. None of them had been ordered to go. All of them volunteered. They loaded the Catalina with medical supplies, emergency rations, cold weather gear, and every survival tool they could fit. The aircraft was already overweight. Before they climbed aboard, Hayes settled into the pilot's seat and began his pre-flight check. Outside, the wind had increased. Snow reduced visibility to less than 50 yards. "Tower, this is Rescue Bird 1 requesting clearance for takeoff," Hayes said into his radio. Static crackled. Then Captain Thee's voice came through. "Rescue Bird 1, you are not cleared for takeoff. Repeat, you do not have authorization." Hayes looked at Webb, who raised an eyebrow. "Tower, we have 15 American souls waiting for us. Request clearance." A long pause. Then Theus spoke again, his voice tight. "God help you, Hayes. You're cleared. Bring them home." The Catalina's engines roared to life. Hayes pushed the throttles forward, and the flying boat began its takeoff run across the frozen runway. Ice chunks kicked up behind them. The aircraft shuddered and groaned. At 80 knots, Hayes pulled back on the yoke. The Catalina lifted off the ground, immediately buffeted by crosswinds that threatened to flip them sideways. Hayes fought the controls, his muscles straining. "Gear up," he called out. Webb retracted the landing gear. Airspeed 120 knots. Altitude 500 feet. "We're climbing into the soup." The Catalina entered the storm system, and visibility dropped to 0. Ice began forming on the wings within minutes. The aircraft pitched and rolled as wind shears hit them from every direction. Chen's voice came over the intercom. "I've got the crash site coordinates locked in. Bearing 270 degrees. Distance 183 miles. Hayes adjusted course. They were flying blind now, trusting their instruments and Chun's navigation. One wrong calculation and they'd fly straight into a mountain. 15 minutes into the flight, the port engine began sputtering. Foster's voice crackled through the intercom. Ice build-up in the carburetor. "I'm switching to emergency heat." Hayes felt the aircraft lose power. They dropped 200 feet before the engine caught again. "We're burning fuel too fast," Webb said, his eyes on the gauges. "If we don't find them within 90 minutes, we won't have enough to make it back." Hayes didn't respond. He was focused on keeping them airborne. Atka Island. The 15 survivors huddled in what remained of their B-24 bomber. The aircraft had crashed 3 hours earlier during a reconnaissance run. They'd been flying at 8,000 feet when the No. 3 engine caught fire. The pilot, Major Thomas Garrett, had tried to maintain altitude, but a second engine failed. They'd gone down hard on the island's eastern slope. 4 men had died in the crash. The rest were injured to varying degrees. Garrett had a broken arm. The bombardier, Lieutenant Carl Jensen, had a concussion. The tail gunner, Sergeant Mike Torres, had suffered severe lacerations from flying metal. But they were alive. For now, the bomber's fuselage provided minimal shelter from the wind. They'd piled parachutes and torn fabric around the openings, but cold air still poured through every gap. Their emergency radio had survived the crash, and they'd managed to send out a distress signal before the batteries died. That was 2 hours ago. Since then, nothing but silence and waiting. Torres sat against the bulkhead, his jacket soaked with blood from his wounds. "Think anyone's coming?" Garrett adjusted his makeshift sling. "Someone heard our signal. They know we're here." "Knowing we're here and being able to reach us are two different things," Jensen said. He was trying to stay awake despite his concussion, knowing that falling asleep could mean never waking up, through a crack in the fuselage. They could see the storm intensifying. Snow fell in thick sheets. The wind had increased to the point where it sounded like a constant roar. Private First Class Eddie Kowalski, the youngest crew member at 19, spoke up. "My brother was on a B-17 that went down over Germany. They told my mum he died quick, clean. But I always wondered if that was true, or if they just said it to make her feel better." "Don't talk like that," Garrett said firmly. "We're not dead yet. We will be if someone doesn't find us before nightfall." Temperatures already dropping. Garrett had no response to that. Because Kowalski was right. Hayes fought the controls of the Catalina as they approached Atka Island. The storm had reached peak intensity. Wind gusts exceeded 70 miles per hour. Ice covered every surface of the aircraft. "I've got landmass on radar," Chen called out. 2 miles ahead. Can you pinpoint the crash site?" Hayes asked. "Negative. Too much interference. We'll need visual confirmation." Hayes descended to 300 feet, pushing the Catalina below the cloud ceiling. Suddenly, the island appeared through the snow, a dark mass of volcanic rock and ice. "There," Webb shouted, pointing. 11 o'clock, half a mile. Hayes saw it. The broken wreckage of the B-24, partially buried in snow on a steep slope. No movement visible. "I need a landing zone," Hayes said, scanning the terrain. "Water or flat ground, anything." Webb studied the coastline through binoculars. "There's a cove 800 yards south of the crash site. Looks relatively protected from the wind." "How's the water?" "Rough, 6-foot swells, but it's the only option." Hayes banked the Catalina toward the cove. Landing a flying boat in these conditions violated every safety protocol in the manual. The waves could flip them. The wind could slam them into rocks. The aircraft could break apart on impact. He lined up his approach anyway. "Everyone strap in," Hayes commanded. "This is going to be rough." The Catalina descended toward the churning water. Hayes throttled back, bleeding off speed. 50 feet, 30 feet, 10 feet. The flying boat hit the water hard. The impact threw everyone forward against their restraints. Water exploded over the windscreen. The aircraft bounced, hit again, bounced once more, then settled into the swells. "We're down," Hayes said, his heart pounding. "Foster, damage report." Foster was already moving through the aircraft, checking for leaks. Hulls intact. "We're taking on some water through the rear hatch seal, but the pumps can handle it. How long can we stay here? In these seas? 20 minutes, maybe 30. After that, the waves will tear us apart." Hayes looked at the beach, 800 yards from the crash site. "Webb, you're with me. Chen, Sullivan, get the medical gear ready. Foster, keep this bird afloat." They deployed the emergency raft, a small rubber boat that could barely hold 4 people. Hayes, Webb, and Sullivan climbed in with medical supplies and survival gear. The moment they pushed away from the Catalina, the wind grabbed them, Hayes, and Webb rowed with everything they had, fighting the waves and current. Each pull of the oars sent fire through their shoulders. The beach seemed impossibly far. 10 minutes later, they hit the rocky shore. All 3 men jumped out and dragged the raft above the waterline. "The crash site's up that slope," Webb said, pointing. About 400 yards, they started climbing. The volcanic rock was slick with ice. The wind threatened to knock them over with every step. Sullivan slipped twice, barely catching himself before sliding back down. When they finally reached the B-24 wreckage, Hayes called out, "U.S. rescue team. Anyone alive in there?" For a moment, nothing. Then a weak voice responded, "Here, we're here." Hayes pulled aside the makeshift barrier of parachutes and crawled into the fuselage. What he saw made his stomach turn. 15 men in various states of hypothermia and injury, some conscious, others barely responsive. The smell of blood and fuel filled the cramped space. Major Garrett struggled to his feet. "You actually came." "We're getting you out," Hayes said. "All of you. But we need to move fast. My aircraft won't survive these seas much longer." Sullivan immediately went to work on the wounded, assessing who needed immediate treatment and who could walk. Torres was in bad shape, his blood loss severe. 2 other men had broken bones. 3 were showing signs of severe hypothermia. "We can't carry all of them at once," Webb said quietly to Hayes. "We'll need at least 3 trips with the raft." Hayes did the math in his head. 3 trips meant over an hour, and they didn't have an hour. The Catalina was already taking a beating. "Then we make 2 trips and overload the raft. Carry the worst casualties first, then come back for the rest." They loaded Torres and 4 other critically injured men onto makeshift stretchers. Getting them down the slope was a nightmare. The rock was too steep, the ice too slick. They slipped and fell repeatedly, but somehow kept the stretchers stabled at the beach. They loaded 5 men into the raft designed for 4. The rubber sides barely stayed above water. Hayes and Webb rowed with desperate strength, waves crashing over them constantly. Foster saw them coming and helped pull the raft alongside the Catalina. Together they hauled the wounded men aboard. "How's she holding?" Hayes asked, water dripping from his face. "Port pontoons taking damage from the rocks. We've got maybe 15 minutes before we're sinking." Hayes and Webb immediately turned the raft around and headed back to shore. No rest, no pause, just row. The second trip was worse. The storm had intensified. Waves now reached 8 feet. The remaining 10 men crowded into the raft, far exceeding its capacity. Water poured in faster than they could bail. Halfway to the Catalina, a wave hit them broadside. 3 men went into the water. Hayes dove in without thinking. The cold hit him like a physical blow, so intense it stopped his breath. He grabbed the nearest man, Private Kowalski, and dragged him back to the raft. Webb pulled in the other 2. They reached the Catalina with the raft nearly submerged. All 15 survivors were now aboard the flying boat, along with the rescue crew. The aircraft sat dangerously low in the water. Hayes climbed into the pilot's seat, his clothes frozen to his body. His hands shook so badly he could barely grip the controls. "Everyone's aboard," Foster reported, "but we're way over max takeoff weight, and the port engine's running rough." Hayes started both engines. The Catalina lurched forward into the waves. He needed speed for takeoff, but every swell threatened to flip them. 30 knots, 40 knots. The flying boat pounded through the water, taking a beating from every wave. "Come on," Hayes muttered. "Come on." 50 knots. 60 knots. The aircraft began to lift, then slammed back down. "Port engines overheating," Foster called out. Hayes ignored him. 70 knots. He pulled back on the yoke with all his strength. The Catalina lifted off the water, engines screaming. They climbed into the storm at a steep angle, fighting for altitude. "Gear up. Flaps up." Hayes shouted. The aircraft shuddered and groaned under the excessive weight. Ice continued to form on the wings. At 500 feet, the port engine died completely. The Catalina dropped like a stone. Hayes pushed the throttle on the starboard engine to maximum, trying to maintain altitude with only one engine. "We're going down," Webb said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Hayes adjusted the trim, trying to compensate for the dead engine. They were losing altitude at 200 feet per minute. "Foster, I need that port engine back right now." "Working on it." 400 feet. 300 feet. They were going to crash. Then Foster's voice came through the intercom. "Try it now." Hayes hit the restart switch. The port engine coughed, sputtered, then roared back to life. The Catalina stabilized. They began climbing again in the cargo area. Sullivan moved among the wounded survivors, providing what medical care he could. Torres had lost consciousness. 2 others were in shock. But they were alive. Major Garrett, despite his broken arm, helped Sullivan with the other wounded. "Your pilot's insane," he said. Sullivan smiled. "Yeah, we're lucky he is." The flight back to Adak took 93 minutes. Hayes flew with one good engine and one that threatened to quit with every mile. Ice built up faster than Foster could manage it. Fuel ran so low that Webb calculated they had less than 10 minutes of reserve when they finally saw Adak's lights through the snow. "Tower, this is Rescue Bird 1 requesting emergency landing clearance," Hayes transmitted. "Rescue Bird 1, you are cleared for immediate landing. Crash crews standing by." Hayes brought the Catalina in for what should have been a routine landing, but nothing about this mission had been routine. The flying boat touched down on Adak's runway and rolled to a stop. Emergency vehicles surrounded them immediately. Medical personnel rushed aboard to evacuate the wounded. Hayes shut down both engines and sat motionless in the pilot's seat. His entire body trembled with exhaustion and cold. He'd been flying for over 4 hours straight, most of it in conditions that should have killed them a dozen times over. Webb put a hand on his shoulder. "We did it." Hayes looked back at the cargo area, where medics were carefully removing the survivors. All 15 of them. Against impossible odds, they'd gotten every single one out alive. Captain Thies appeared in the cockpit doorway. His expression was unreadable. "Lieutenant Hayes, you directly disobeyed orders, violated multiple safety protocols, and risked the lives of your entire crew on an unauthorized mission." Hayes met his gaze. "Yes, sir." Thies was quiet for a moment. Then he saluted. "Best damn insubordination I've ever witnessed." "Well done." The aftermath came swiftly. The official record showed no rescue mission. Hayes and his crew received no commendations, no medals, no recognition. The mission never happened, at least not in any official capacity. But the 15 men who'd been pulled from that frozen island knew. They carried that knowledge for the rest of their lives. Torres survived his injuries and returned to his family in Texas. He named his first son James, after the pilot who'd saved his life. Kowalski made it home to Chicago and became a teacher. He told his students about the day someone flew through a storm to bring him back from the edge of death. Major Garrett went on to fly 23 more combat missions. He never forgot the sound of Hayes' voice calling into that wrecked fuselage, promising to get them all out. Hayes continued flying in the Aleutians until the Japanese withdrew from the island chain in 1943. He flew another 48 missions, each one dangerous, none quite as impossible as that November day. He never talked about the rescue. Not to his fellow pilots, not to his family, not to anyone. It was just another mission in a war full of impossible missions. But in 1989, 46 years after that frozen day, Torres organized a reunion. 11 of the 15 survivors were still alive. They gathered in San Diego, old men now, with gray hair and grandchildren. They tracked down Hayes, who was 71 and living quietly in Oregon. They'd pooled their resources and commissioned a plaque. It read, "To Lieutenant James Hayes and the crew of Rescue Bird 1, who defied orders, flew through hell, and brought 15 brothers home." We will never forget when they presented it to him. Hayes stared at it for a long time. His hands, still steady despite his age, traced the engraved letters. "I was just doing my job," he said quietly. Torres shook his head. "No, sir, you did something impossible. And you did it because it was right." Hayes looked at the men gathered around him. They'd all gone on to live full lives. Families, careers, grandchildren, decades of moments that never would have happened if he'd followed orders that day. "Would you do it again?" Kowalski asked. "Knowing what you know now, would you still fly into that storm?" Hayes didn't hesitate. Every single time. The story of Rescue Bird 1 remained largely unknown for decades. No official records acknowledged it. No history books mentioned it. It existed only in the memories of those who lived it. But that's the nature of real heroism. It doesn't need recognition or glory. It happens in the forgotten corners of war, in the moments between official reports, when ordinary people make extraordinary choices. Hayes died in 1994 at the age of 76. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II, but gave no details of specific missions. The newspapers didn't know about Atka Island. They didn't know about 15 men freezing to death and one pilot who refused to let them die at his funeral. 11 old men sat in the front row. They'd flown across the country to be there. And when the service ended, Torres placed something on Hayes' casket. It was a small metal model of a PBY Catalina flying boat. Attached to it was a note that read, "You brought us home. Now, rest easy, brother. We've got the watch." The true measure of courage isn't found in the battles everyone remembers. It's in the moments no one sees, the choices made when there's no audience, no medal waiting, no promise of recognition. It's in the frozen cockpit of an overloaded aircraft, flying through a storm that should be impossible to survive, all for the chance to bring strangers home. 15 men lived because one pilot looked at an impossible mission and said, yes, anyway. He didn't do it for glory. He didn't do it for recognition. He did it because it was right, and because those 15 lives mattered more than any order or regulation. That's the story they don't teach in history class. The rescue that never officially happened. The mission that saved 15 lives and asked for nothing in return, except the quiet satisfaction of knowing he'd done everything he could in the end. Maybe that's the most important story of all. Not the grand battles or famous generals, but the individual moments of choice. The split second when someone decides that doing the right thing matters more than following the safe path. Hayes made that choice on a frozen November day in 1943, and 15 families got to welcome their sons, brothers, and fathers home because of it. The rest is just wind and snow and the fading echo of engines in the storm.